Or
Uh,
did you get?
I could send them at the end of the day again. They give you a little
Okay,
something to chew on overnight, I think. Yeah.
okay, cool,
So it'll be two, for every two conferences.
cool.
Cool. Mm-mm. Okay, sisters and brothers and other friends there on online, welcome to the afternoon session. For some people, this is always the hardest one, waking up after your afternoon nap. Good strong cup of tea, and I'm ready to go. Forgive me how long this refrain is, but again, just kind of hum along and then sing along when you feel ready for it. The refrain based on 23rd chapter of Matthew, the verses instead, lines from St. Paul from the letter to the Corinthians. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. Though not bound to anyone, I have made myself a slave, so to win the souls of many for the Lord. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. Everything to anyone, I do everything for all, so to win the souls of many for the Lord. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. So our next step, remember this morning we were talking about Prometheus, this titan of Greek mythology. There was a brilliant essay. My gosh, I must have read it in 1986 or so, from a little collection of leftover essays of Thomas Merton called The Raids on the Unspeakable. And he said that Christianity's answer to this fascination with Prometheus stealing the fire from heaven is actually that we believe, in spite of what we might have absorbed from our teachers, we believe that God wants to give us the fire. The prodigal father says to the sons, all I have is yours. And Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke, I came to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. One wonders if he didn't know this story of Prometheus. I came to bring fire on the earth, and the Father sent me to bring it. And I wish it were already kindled. And we keep trying to steal the fire from heaven, but the problem is, I think, is we don't know where heaven is. It's not some light years away. It's the very ground of our being and our consciousness. It's the fire in the heart of our heart. The irony is that the fire already blazes in each one of us, and yet it's somehow the same fire of the Holy Spirit, the fire of divinity. There's a great image that comes out of India about the deer who goes around, smells musk, and goes around trying to find out where the musk is and eating grass. Well, in fact, the smell of the musk is coming out of the deer, her and himself. This is a wonderful image for this too. Where's the fire? The fire's inside of us. God has put the love of his own love inside of us by the Spirit living in us. It's even, I want to say, my own way of thinking of this, it's even the fire of Eros, the divine madness that the Greeks would call, that we Christians believe planted inside of us as our birthright, the divine creative energy. If you think about it, what was the primal flaw, the tragic flaw of Adam and Eve? Maybe it was only the fact that they grasped at wisdom in life. They grabbed at it and were no longer content to receive it as a gift. The very opposite of what Christ does, and not cling to divinity. So maybe even the original sin is something like grabbing for power, like Prometheus. A little later in the book of Genesis, we hear the story of the Tower of Babel, and it's almost the same dynamic, trying to climb that ladder to heaven, trying to storm the castle rather than to be invited in. I remember when I think I was a postulant, quite new in the monastic life, and I just read Jacques Maritain book on intuition and intuition and the poetic mind. I can't remember the exact name of it now. And I had drawn this diagram of how I was laying out, human anthropology and cosmology and everything. I had it on a piece of paper, and I brought it into my confrere, my elder confrere, now deceased Father Bruno, a really brilliant man. And I was really proud of it. And I showed him this little scheme I'd come up with. And he says, Cyprian, he says, it's like you built a ladder to the moon. And I said, what? And he says, looks like you built a ladder to the moon. He says, you're going to get to that top of that ladder, though, and you're going to find out that you're still 238,899 miles away from the moon. The rest is grace. There's only so far you can climb on your own. The rest is grace. We can't just storm the castle. We don't have to steal the fire. You climb that ladder up, and you're going to meet God coming down. The gift is not like the transgression, St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans. If the transgression, stealing the fire from heaven, eating the forbidden fruit, climbing the ladder to heaven, if the transgression was in the jealous grasping, the gift is freely given. It can't be stolen. It can't be earned. And that's, again, what we learned from the Kenosis hymn. Christ Jesus was not like Adam and Eve. He was the opposite. He does not grab. Even though he was in a state of God, he didn't deem equality with God something to grasp at, something he had climbed to. He emptied himself. He went back to his interdependency on God and the Spirit, and therefore, God raised him on high and gave him the name above all other names. The gift is not like the offense. If the offense was grabbing and clinging and claiming and grasping, the gift is Christ Jesus emptying, trusting, receiving. Now, that doesn't mean we blithely accept oppression, suppression, repression, injustice, and servitude, even at a local level, even at a micro level, even at a personal level. But it does mean that real power and real freedom lie in being participants in the divine nature, the relationship with God that Jesus calls us to when he says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. That's pretty darn close, because how can a branch be separate from the vine? And of course, that leads us to discern how this applies to all of our relationships. It's kind of counterintuitive. I know I'm speaking to a group of mostly women, but I have to think of this in terms of us lunk-headed males. because power, I don't know, but we say this about women, we say this about men, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. And so much in typical worldly affairs encourages us to believe that this is something to be sought after. Power over others, to be king of the mountain, to be CEO, to be boss. I was with the monks at St. Martin's in Lacey, Washington a couple of weeks ago, and suddenly I burst out and said, I'm looking ahead of me. I'll be 66 in a week. I'm looking ahead of me at these men in their late 70s and 80s and 90s, still grabbing after power, still looking for more wealth, still climbing this ladder. And I'm thinking, my gosh, is that all there is? Even there in your 80s and 90s, still clinging after power and authority? To be a boss, to be a pastor, to be cardinal, to be prince of the church. Jesus says very clearly, it shall not be that way with you. It shall not be that way with you. The greatest among you is the one who serves. I'm talking to Benedictines here, so I don't want to kind of go over things already, but I want to tell you a little bit something from my own experience and then talk a little bit about the rule of St. Benedict. Hopefully this will be somewhat helpful also for our oblates. These ladders, like I mentioned in my Ladder to the Moon, are very common in the writings about the spiritual life, particularly in monastic literature, and they always seem to be climbing upward to heaven, such as the ladder of divine ascent of the 7th century abbot John Climacus of Sinai. That's the most famous one, I think. But to our surprise, we find that the ladder that we climb to heaven actually goes down. Not only is God coming down, but the ladder we're supposed to climb goes down too. It goes down into our humanity, goes down into service. Gregory of Nyssa talks about an ascent to the depths of the heart. Pope Benedict said, God descends and we ascend by descending. And that to me is the kind of leadership that St. Benedict has in mind throughout his rule for monks as well. I have some quotes here for you. Again, sisters, you may know this all so well. I hope it's not too pedantic for you. Oh, where am I? I missed one. I lost the slide. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. There it is. I goofed you up. St. Benedict says, first of all, that the abbot should be loved more than feared, which is kind of interesting. The Latin, it usually gets translated loved rather than feared. And that's a bit of a mistranslation. The Latin's pretty clear here. Plus amare, loved more than feared. Having just spent 10.5 years as a prior of a community, and maybe your prioress and sub-prioress can relate to this, a little bit of fear is okay every now and then. Yeah, but the abbot or the abbess, the prioress should strive to be loved more than feared. Later in the rule, Benedict quotes this, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out all fear. For fear has to do with punishment. Whoever fears hasn't reached perfection in love. There was another line. It was actually when I was at St. Martin's that they were reading from the rule, and I heard this line go by, and I thought, there it is again, that images I love so much of the reign of God that work by dissolving and permeating. This is in chapter 2 of the rule, talking about the qualities of the abbot, the abbess. Everything he or she teaches or commands should permeate the minds of their disciples, like yeast, like salt, like the leaven of divine justice. Anyway, back to that. Here, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out all fear. That's at the end of Benedict's chapter on the steps of humility. The way we get to perfect love, according to Benedict, is through perfect humility. And as you may remember, foot washing gets mentioned 3 times in Benedict's rule, not just as a necessity either. It's a ritual. It's a symbolic action. And one of the mentions is in the reception of guests, and it's the abbot himself or the abbess herself was supposed to wash the feet of the newly arrived. greeting them as if they were Christ. The head of the community is supposed to do the most subservient thing to the guest who walks in the door. And when Benedict calls for bringing the members of the community together for council, a monastic community is not necessarily a democracy, but it's certainly not a dictatorship either. He urges the abbot or the abbess to listen even to the youngest members of the community. So this is the kind of leadership Benedict is cultivating here. God descends to the point of death on the cross, and we ascend to God by accompanying God on this descending path. This blends right into our monastic life, our monastic way of being with each other. A little story from my own history. As I mentioned, I'm on sabbatical right now from after 10 and a half years of service as prior of our community. And just before the election, when it became, it went from possible to probable to inevitable that I was going to be elected the next prior of the community, I read through this very comprehensive 55-page essay in the appendix of the RB 80, which is the definitive modern translation, the most well-read commentary on the rule that we have these days. And I was reading this, especially this section regarding the abbot. According to the rule, the prior of the monastery, like you have a prior, it's not an abbess. The prior of the monastery in the rule is actually the second in command under the abbot or the abbess. But in the men's traditions, in many of the Reformed traditions, especially the hermit tradition from which I come, they took the top level off in medieval times because often the abbots in those days were involved in economic and political intrigue, and they preferred their leaders to be more humble, a primus inter pares, we would say, first among equals. But the qualities of the abbot still apply. I like to say it's like all the work without the perks. I got through TSA a lot faster in the airport. They didn't have the cross and the ring and all that. Still, at any rate, the whole first part of this essay on the qualities of the abbot were about pre-Benedictine leadership and not necessarily monastic leaders of communities. The whole second part was about this understanding of the abbot from Benedict on. And I actually read the second part first and only then came back to the first part. And not much in the second part really touched me. I have to admit, mostly it just intimidated me. The only other real experience of a monastery I'd had before was at an archabbey. I studied at St. Meinrad years ago, and an archabbot, and there's a pectoral cross and the ring and the crozier surrounded by copious high ceremonies and formalities. And our place in Big Sur, very informal. I was teasing once, I was at St. Meinrad and I saw a little note on the board that says, "Reminder to the brothers, you must wear black socks with your black shoes." And I thought to myself, I'm lucky if our guys even wear shoes when they show up. That's how informal we are. But anyway, then I went back and read the first part of the essay, which was about spiritual fatherhood, spiritual parenting in the scriptures. It was about the Abbas of the desert and the early other monastic communities in Egypt, the early monastic experiments in Cappadocia. And right at the very end of this section, I found this image from the 4th century Cappadocian mystical writer Gregory of Nyssa that struck me very, very deeply. It's from a treatise entitled On the Christian Mode of Life. And actually, this treatise is in that little Benedictine book of daily prayer. I found it years later. When Gregory writes about the obligations of the leaders, those who are in charge, he doesn't compare them to a father, to a parent. He doesn't use the word Abba, Amma. He uses the Greek word paidagogos. Paidagogos. Let me see if I can find that for you. There it is. Sometimes that word gets translated as skilled educator, but actually in ancient times, the paidagogos, listen to this, was the slave that the parents hired to train their children. The leader of the Christian community should be like a paidagogos, the slave that the parents hire to train their children. Many among the upper classes of Greek and Roman families, a trustworthy slave would be hired to lead the children back and forth to school, but also would be like to teach them manners and tutor them outside of the classroom. And that's what the leader of a Christian community, of a Christian family ought to be like a paidagogos. And I made these little stickers and I put them all over the place in my drawer in the sacristy and underneath where I hung up my cowl, just to remind me every day that's what my real job was. I'm just somebody that got hired to take care of the kids, meaning I'm answerable to someone greater, like a teacher who has to discipline a child, knowing that he's going to have to answer to the parents later on, knowing that she's going to have to deal with the kid's parents. It's the same with me. I remember a couple of times I had to address one brother, for instance, about a drinking problem. I had to address another guy about telling him he couldn't drive anymore, which is a horrible conversation to have with an elderly man. And they got mad at me. And I said, look, brother, I have to answer to somebody else. I know you don't like me right now, but I'm not here for you to like me. I've got to answer to somebody else. I'm just the guy that got hired to take care of the kids. I thought that was really beautiful. And obviously, I thought much in keeping with the gospel, too. You know, in the rule of Benedict, even as in some earlier Christian writings, there could be this kind of mixed metaphor about Trinitarian language. Sometimes Jesus himself is referred to as a father. But Clement of Alexandria, for instance, one of the other great early monastic Christian writers, refers to Christ too mainly as a paidagogos. This was the second book of a trilogy that he wrote in which he develops the Christian ethic. He's borrowing heavily from Stoic philosophy, but for him, the real instructor, the real paidagogos, the real instructor is the incarnate logos. So this is not an accidental choice of the words that would have had all those resonances for the ancient minds. So Jesus, for St. Benedict, for Clement of Alexandria, for Gregory of Nyssa, instead of being a Promethean character, stealing the fire from heaven and bringing it down to the mortals, Jesus is more like a slave whom the fire is entrusted with who the father has entrusted with the task of instructing the children and bringing them the fire. At the same time, though, this attitude of humility, as far as I can see in the rule, is a hallmark of any monastic, of any nun, of any monk, as far as St. Benedict is concerned, not just the abbess, not just the abbot. Benedict devotes that one long, very difficult chapter 7 to what he calls the 12 steps of humility. And right at the beginning of the chapter, he's quoting the Gospel of Luke. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And from there on out, the language that Benedict uses is very hard, even shocking for us moderns to hear, especially when so many of us have been wounded by hierarchical abuse or family dysfunction. And now we've been trained in the language of emotional intelligence and recovery. But there it is. St. Benedict asks the nuns and monks to quietly embrace suffering, even in difficult and unjust situations, to be content with lowly treatment, and especially to be convinced that we're inferior to all. Again, hard language for us to hear in this day and age. But we, of course, have to keep in mind here the crucified Christ, the suffering servant. But even there, for a mature person, also that has to be put in the context of a very sturdy, real, mature ego, as well as a healthy image of God. If we've got a strong ego, a healthy image of God, we could hear words like that without them freaking us out. The other steps in these steps of humility are a little easier to nuance and contextualize, remembering that God is always watching, which goes right along with not concealing your thoughts from your spiritual Amma, from your spiritual Abba, rigorous honesty. In other words, who am I to judge? If I look how hard I've struggled in my own life with all the help I've had, it should be easy to be humble, or at least not to be proud or arrogant or judgmental. And Benedict tells his nuns and monks they should manifest humility in their bearing no less than in their heart, which includes things like controlling the tongue, not being given to ready laughter, speaking gently, so that our humility is evident everywhere, at liturgy, on a journey, in the garden, in the field. Now, that, of course, can't possibly mean we're just supposed to put on a show. In the old days, we'd say ad oculos, just for the eyes, for everyone to see how humble we are. You remember that character from David Copperfield, Uriah Heep, the obsequious clerk who pretends to be humble and to want to serve David Copperfield well, but in reality, he's cheating him along the way. And Jesus warns him. I had a classmate when I was still a novice and junior too. He left him during our juniorate, and he always just looked terrible. He'd come into choir just sad and angry, and he wasn't that way naturally. And I'd say his name was Ezekiel, and I said, Ezekiel, you look so miserable. And he says, I always try to look as miserable as possible for the edification of our guests. But I think the real key is the admonition back in the second and third step of humility, not to love our own will, just as Jesus himself says, I have not come to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. So for the monk, that means, for the nun, that means to submit to legitimate authority, to do nothing but what's endorsed by the common rule of the community and by conversatio, this constant dialogue with the tradition to teach us how to be. St. Benedict makes such a big point of this throughout the rule, tying humility to obedience as if they go together and form the basis of monastic life, almost as if they're one virtue, humble obedience, obedient humility. Maybe that's the one hallmark of the Benedictine monastic. But obedience isn't just obedience to the abbot or to the rule. And this is where I think we get some real clarity. And I just love this. I preached on this so many times, the brothers probably got tired of hearing about it. Benedict names this entire chapter, chapter 71. And by the way, our former prior general, Benedetto Colati, said we should start at chapter 71 and 72 and go backwards in the rule. Ut obedientes sibi sunt in vicem, that they may obey one another. Oh, boy, I didn't write that well. That they may ober one another, that they may obey one another, they may obey each other. Obedience is a blessing shown by all, not only to the abbot, but also to one another as brothers and sisters. And then the next chapter, chapter 72, on the good zeal of the monastic, he quotes Romans 12, they should try to be the first to show respect to the other, and then says, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body and behavior, earnestly competing in obedience to one another. No one is to pursue what they judge best for themselves, but instead what they judge best for someone else. That's real humility. It's tied to obedience, and it's tied to service, and it's tied to charity. That's the hallmark of the Christian monastic community, that we are each of us pedagogos for each other. And ultimately, it's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. Humility means I care more about you over me. Humility means loving my neighbor as myself. Humility means, like we said at that entrance, that introduction to the Kenosis hymn, let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Then have the same consciousness as Christ Jesus. I'm going to go one step further with this and say, this is not just a monastic impulse. I'm convinced that the Christian impulse itself is marked by this tendency, this kind of positive humility, mutual obedience. My gosh, what a beautiful theme that would be for any community, for any parish. It applies to a parent, to a nurse, to a laborer, to a cook, to a politician, to a public servant. It darn well applies to a priest or religious of any kind, even a bishop, a cardinal, and a pope. In that same essay by Gregory of Nyssa on Christian leadership, as I mentioned earlier, before he writes about leaders, he's writing about everyday Christians. And he says, this is really worth looking up in your Benedictine daily prayer if you have that. He says, whoops, yeah, that's another part. You can get to that. They should be ready to do whatever is confided to them with hope and eagerness. There's a hallmark of a Christian. Oh, see how these Christians are? we could confide anything to them, but they do it with hope and eagerness. They will do it as Christ's servants for the good of their brothers and sisters. And then he quotes the gospel too. Let them take the last place and be servants of all. Such persons must be subject to all others and serve their brothers and sisters as though they were their debtors. You see, it's all more positive than negative. It's not so much about walking around looking humble, much more about our stance in the world. How are we in the world? Who are we in the world as a follower of Jesus, as an imitator of Jesus? Being a servant, and not just humble, but humble servants. Matthew must have really loved this theme because he has Jesus say it very strongly. This is Matthew 20. Jesus called them and said, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. I love this line. He says, it will not be so among you. It won't be like that with you. Whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. I gave this talk to seminarians once, a couple of years ago. And these are guys who get ready to be ordained to go out into the parish. And there's a lot of clericalism I found among a lot of young seminarians. And I said, brothers, these are all men. There are no hidden messages here. There's no subtlety to this. This is the bottom line of the gospel. The greatest among us are the ones who are called to serve. It shall not be otherwise with you. It shall not be otherwise with us. This is meant for all of us, for everybody, especially we servant leaders in the church. We could sing that song again, and I'll let you go. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. Still I must do all I do for the sake of the good news, and to win the souls of many for the Lord. The greatest among you must be the one who serves, and the first one among you must meet the needs of all, as the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve, and who lay his life down as ransom for all. Okay, we're done for today. Bye. See you tomorrow morning.